on Mirror Now. I'm Heena Gambhir. Of late, there have been a number of international agencies that have released certain reports criticizing India on a number of issues. The latest addition to this is the US report on international religious freedom in India. India has now reacted sharply to the report. Ministry of External Affairs has slammed US senior officials over its report and have called it ill-informed. In fact, what is mentioned in the report specifically about India has been called as ill-informed comments. India also alleges vote bank politics in international relations by the US. The government has said that the assessment in the report by US was based on motivated inputs and biased views. US State Department 2021 report on international religious freedom alleges that in India, attacks on minority communities, including killings, assaults, intimidation, continued throughout the year. The report was released by the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, and it talks about the status and violations of religious freedom across the world. Listen in.
The report documents how religious freedom and the rights of religious minorities are under threat in communities around the world. For example, in India, the world's largest democracy and home to a great diversity of faiths, we've seen rising attacks on people in places of worship. In Vietnam, where authorities harass members of unregistered religious communities. In Nigeria, where several state governments are using anti-defamation and blasphemy laws to punish people for expressing their beliefs.
And joining us on this debate on the broadcast this evening is Maruf Raza, Group Consulting Editor, Times Network. We will be joined by Captain Alok Bansal, Retired Director, India Foundation, Shekhar Iyer, Senior Journalist, Major General Dr. Yash Moore, retired, who's now a defense analyst, is going to be joining us as well. Dr. Sumant C. Raman, political analyst, also live with us on the broadcast this evening. Good evening to all of you. Thank you for joining us here on Urban Debate on Mirror Now this evening. Maruf Raza, I want to begin the discussion with you. You know, there are two issues here. One is about the attacks on minorities in India and in different parts of the world. And second, United States of America specifically mentioning India in its report with the details that it has come out with on what is happening in India. How will you like to react to this and a statement that has now gone from the Ministry of External Affairs?
Ask me upfront, I wouldn't have reacted to it to give dignity to the report. But because we have reacted to it, then we are responding to the allegations to say, I'm right and you're wrong. The basic point to understand is, one, that the US government, as per its election promises, is looking at addressing the issues that had brought it into power, wherein they would address human rights concerns, issues related with freedom, whether it's freedom of religion or freedom of speech or whatever. And the US is a big champion of these issues. But the third thing is that how many countries really take seriously US observations? Take, for instance, the case of China. I mean, everyone knows that China's human rights record and its abuses of minorities, especially in Uyghur areas, where millions have been put into camps to try and make better Muslims out of them, is something which is a matter of abhorrence to the Muslim world. But even many Arab countries don't comment on it, and Pakistan certainly doesn't comment on it because they don't want to upset the Chinese. So this is a game that big powers play. At the end of the Cold War, from 1990 onwards, human rights issues, freedom issues, and others became a big stick for these countries to try and pressurize countries like ours, which are still evolving in many areas. As a democracy, our credentials are without doubt outstanding. But there are other areas where from time to time, you do see activities which the world takes and sits notice to, because here, firstly, there are Western organizations that are connected with the NGOs in India. So when their funding or their licenses are suspended, this comes in for criticism. nobody looks at the fact that India does allow a very large number of minorities. It has amongst the largest Muslim populations in the world. And by and large, they're allowed to practice their religion unhindered. Now, if there are some concerns at some levels, the courts are there. There are ways to address it, which in many other evolving countries, this mechanism doesn't exist. Yes, there are aberrations, but the aberration is not a rule. The second thing is that, yes, Prime Minister Modi was asked in his first tenure when he visited Downing Street by a British journalist that Mr. Prime Minister, and words to the effect, that can we say that there is more intolerance now at the time of your government to minorities and religious issues than there was earlier? And he responded pretty vigorously to say that our constitution protects their rights. So it is unfair to point fingers at India per se. Having said all that, you see, the US also engages with a lot of countries that are precisely on America's radar screen for such issues, whether it is trade with China, whether it is human rights issues in the Arab world, whether it is Pakistan, where the Baluch and other minorities are living in real living hell. So I think we should not get too worked up about some observations of this nature. The NGOs and the study groups under the US Foreign Office have a job to do. Our country has its own agenda and we have to get on with it. If somebody does point out, and if there is need for course correction, we should get on with that without getting too agitated. We have to have a more mature.
So essentially, you're of the view that India should not have really reacted to this kind of a report. You have raised a couple of other interesting points as well, and I'll speak about the aberration bit that you've mentioned in just a bit. Let me also take the opening comments from my other guests as well. Captain Alok Bansal, what is your view on the report by the US and response by India? Because, it's not for the first time we have seen US talking about what's happening within the country, what's not happening within the country. In April also, during a joint press conference, when in the presence of External Affairs Minister and Defense Minister, Antony Blinken had only mentioned that we regularly engage with our Indian partners. We are monitoring some recent concerning developments in India, including a rise in human rights abuses by some government, police and prison officials. At that time also, India had reacted. But now again, this report.
See, firstly, the US has assigned to itself the role of a global policeman. So it keeps passing judgment on others. Now, this sort of a report, if any other country was doing so, would be considered a blatant interference in somebody else's internal affairs. Having said that, please, let's be very clear that for last 1 year, the 2021, about which the report talks of, our enemies, especially Pakistan and China, have sought to create an impression that there has been a persecution of religious minorities. I think if you read Dr. Jaishankar's remarks, which says very clearly that in a naturally pluralistic society like India, all communities have existed side by side and have practiced their faith without any restrictions. And I think India is the most pluralistic society that we can see anywhere. And in fact, for centuries, when other communities and religions were persecuted, like Jews, etc., they have actually thrived in this country without any restrictions. So having said that, now look at US. Last year, we had Black Lives Matters. We have seen gun violence. There are so many problems. So for a country like US to point fingers at somebody like India, to my mind, is not prudent. There have been some aberrations, and I would not like to deny that, yes, there have been some issues, but they have all been dealt with. I think the government of the day has dealt it. But somehow politicking has sought to project as if these cases have been overlooked. And that's, I think, what a country like US has picked up superficial news reports, etc., which they have used to come out with a report like this. To my mind, this report needs to be countered and countered strongly. Firstly, US has no business passing a judgment on other countries and their internal affairs, especially on a country which has been pluralistic from times immemorial, and which has actually propagated a pluralistic.
Okay, interesting. Okay, interesting. Sumansi Raman, what is your view? We have one guest saying that India shouldn't have really responded to this kind of a report. Another guest saying the report needs to be countered and countered strongly. Where do you stand on one, what the report says, and the response by India?
First of all, I agree with Maruf and the other panelists in terms of whether the US should be passing judgment on others. I agree on that. They've got no business to do that. Having said that, I think we need to look within. We can look at this statement in two ways. Should the US be saying it? And who are they to say it? Two, is there truth in what they are saying? Now, the point is, we need to ask ourselves how we are doing on religious freedom vis-a-vis how we were doing. I find this absurd to go and compare ourselves with Pakistan and compare ourselves with the other countries and say that minorities are living in hell there, therefore they are better off here. For us, the benchmark has to be the past versus now. Are things better or are things worse? If things are worse, why are they worse? Second, we need to get more minority voices to speak on this topic. There's no point in us trying to, pass judgment on an issue like this. Call representatives of minority associations. Ask them, how do you feel regarding religious freedom in this country? And, I find the use of the word...
Sumansi Raman, like I said in the beginning only, there are two issues here. One, the issue of minorities within the country, and second, United States of America slamming India in its report and how India has reacted. Tonight we are discussing, as Captain Alok Bansal very rightly put, that in a way, US has assumed the role of this global policeman passing judgments on every country. What is the provocation here is what we are trying to understand and decode.
This is not the first time that the US has been passing judgment. They have been passing judgment on the rest of the world for several decades now. So I don't think that this is something unique that they're doing. And clearly, I support our government in whatever response that they are giving to the US. So my concern is on the second part. Is this statement carrying with it a grain of truth or not? That is the thing that we need to see, because if it does, irrespective of the unjustified manner in which the United States has said it, if that statement carries a grain of truth, then we need to look within and see what we can do to address it. Not because the US is telling us that, but because that is a statement that may carry a grain of truth. Now, the point is, religious freedoms have increasingly, look, at the end of the day, a lot of this is perception, right? Every other day you have a story on mainstream media being carried, which are now literally, anti-minority stories. And we want to correct all the wrongs of history. We want to go and dig up various religious places now. So what are we talking about? Naturally, minorities feel threatened. And we should be getting opinions from them rather than try to sit in judgment and say, no, they're all very happy.
But do we need opinions from the US, Shekhar Iyer?
No.
Because we have seen many times in the past also, West has always tried to be very biased judge of India's domestic affairs. Okay, Sumansi Raman, then Shekhar Iyer. Okay, complete your point.
One sentence. My point is, I think Maruf used the word, India has allowed the minorities, to practice their religion freely. I remember distinctly the word allow came in. I think that allowing is itself a part of a problem, because this is as much their country as it is the country of the majority community. So there is no question of anybody allowing anybody else the freedom. The Indian state is supposed
Maruf
to be
would like
secular.
to respond, and then I'll go across to Shekhar Iyer.
I don't want to extend this debate, and I want you to get the other distinguished guests in. Just two quick points. When in television debates, you can't be completely 100% correct with your grammar and semantics. What I was trying to say, India is allowed is that the Indian Constitution allows, which means that it is embedded in the constitutional rights that every citizen, including the minorities, enjoy. That's the point I was trying to make. I'm not trying to say that the government of India of the current day is doing a favor to the minorities. I'm from the minority community, Mr. Saman, as you would know, and I don't feel threatened at all. So the next point is that you said that criticizing or trying to compare ourselves with Pakistan or China, etc. The point I was trying to say was the US judgment that is passed on a whole lot of countries, and this report has chapters on lots of countries. It is not an India-centric report. It has chapters on countries. And in the chapters on the countries, a lot of them have come in for scathing criticism, and they tend to dismiss it because it doesn't agree with their state of play. So all I was suggesting is that why go into a tizzy because America has told you. I agree with you, Mr. Raman, that there are issues that require a little soul searching, and we should not deny that.
Absolutely. Shekhar Iyer, do you also believe that West always has tried to be a very biased judge of India's domestic affairs? How do you see India's response? Do you agree with what Maruf said earlier, that India shouldn't have really responded? Why give credence to such a report?
Well, Heena, I agree with Maruf Raja as well as Captain Alo, and to a great extent what Dr. Subansi Raman said. But the point is, these reports are not published in isolation or some annual exercise. I mean, and particularly the US Secretary of State, particularly mentioning India during his oral briefing. I mean, there are certain angles to this, but the point is, India is no longer a country that will go on a self-flagellation exercise, as used to happen earlier. Today, okay, we know our problems, but who is America to say, look at the condition in America? You just saw that particular incident on Texas. So helpless children were massacred. I mean, a country that should bother about, and what about incidents of racism, which is happening day in and day out? There are so many problems in this country, and this country wants to do dadagiri. And today, we are no longer going to get, as Maruf Raja pointed out, we are not going to get into self-flagellation, which unfortunately we used to do. We used to get worried by what New York Times wrote, Washington Post said, or what London Times said. This kind of thing is gone. Yes, we know what is wrong in our country. There are a lot of things to be set right. We ourselves feel bad about it because it's a democratic country. But then, America's purpose is not just to do its human rights commitment. There are a lot of politics in this. When you cannot pressurize India on Ukraine, you can make an oral mention of India at a level like US Secretary of State. But then India had to respond for a simple reason. If India had not responded, and this response would not have come without the highest clearance, because it would appear as if we are on the defensive. And this is not the first time India has responded, just as this is not the first time they have pointed out. But what India has said this time is very interesting. It has mentioned about the problems of gun culture, racism, and human rights issues there. That is something which Jaishankar himself said it here in one of those briefings. So therefore, I think we will have to look at it the way it is. Yes, I mean, this is a free world. People can comment on each other's institution. But let us not get into that kind of thing which Maruf Raja rightly pointed out and Captain Alok also pointed out. Let's look at it for what it is. Yes, we have a lot to do, but then we have strong institutions like judiciary. We have strong institutions like our own legislature and several watchdog bodies. And we must also remember, as Maruf Raja pointed out, these reports are also fed by motivated bias, as our Indian response says. There are NGOs.
And this is exactly what India has also mentioned in its response.
So there are several institutions, behind.
Interesting, Major General.
Yeah, and it's time everyone realizes.
Major General Yashmore.
India is too big a country to get, get panicky on such reports.
Okay, but you also believe that a response of this kind was necessary. And in any case, Major General Yashmore, we have seen India being a little more aggressive now when it comes to, any country pointing fingers at India, we have seen that change also taking place. But here specifically in this report, which according to the US gives its, US's perspective to the status and violations of religious freedoms across the globe, what can be the provocation in your view, that India specifically has been highlighted, has been mentioned?
What I see, Heena, and what is happening, the perception, spoke of perception, what is happening on the mainstream media, especially vernacular Hindi media, and a lot of social media, whether it's Facebook, WhatsApp, and other, system. There appears to be an amazing amount of hate that is being spewed every day through our, medium going to it won't even have been discussed. But some soul searching, some amount of, at least at the police reforms at the Thana level, where people are really affected, where FIRs don't get lodged or people feel they're being cornered. And this narrative which is coming from our mainstream media, that sometimes does give an impression to an outsider that there appears to be some kind of minority, bashing or minority pushback in India. However, India doesn't have to learn any lessons from US or any Western country. We have our ethos, we have our ethics, and by and large, our country has stood strong as far as religious interfaith harmony is concerned. So my take would be, let's clamp down on hate that goes through our social media handles, through our, you look at the debates on TV these days. 90% debates these days are only trying to create a kind of religious ideologies are hardening all over the world.
Well, yes,
but India needs to be very careful on that front, and we need to, appear, at least the government should appear to be absolutely fair as far as all the people, all citizens are equal,
Okay. Maruf, now you spoke about the issue of aberration. If there is a racial attack on an Indian on American soil, does America blame the offender or the administration? It is termed as an aberration there. But if in India there are incidents, that have been reported, that have been quoted in this report specifically, why is it being called as a trend or a rule? Do you see it as some sort of a pressure tactic? Because we know India has remained neutral as far as, the crisis between Russia and Ukraine is concerned. Can that be the motivation?
I don't think that is the motivation because of India's neutrality on the issue of Ukraine, because if that was it, then I don't think Mr. Modi would have been invited to the Quad summit. The Quad leaders that met, they were all anti-Russia in more ways than one. But here was the leader of a country which clearly had taken a considered position on which side to go with or stay neutral. And as Prime Minister Narasimha Rao once said, even not taking a decision is a decision itself. Now, when it comes to the issues related with, minority rights, aberrations, etc., you see, there's an old adage, I think you're familiar with it. It says that bad news is good news is no news. So what happens is that, I was reading a book a while ago that nobody really talks about all the good that happens all over the world, but we only talk about all the things that raise eyebrows. So whether it is a news reportage or it's any television coverage, everyone's running around issues trying to make it, cause greater interest and concern, therefore draw eyeballs or what have you. But a matured country, a self-assured country should get on with its agenda. And I think India is doing much of that. There are issues, and I think I would attribute that largely to vote bank politics, and where people tend to use such kind of emotional inflammation to try and get people to take a side, you are with them or against them kind of thing. But if we for a moment set aside vote bank politics and we look at the greater good of India, because no country can become a superpower if it is divided within. You have to be consolidated as a country, be proud, and stand up for what you believe, and you can take on superpowers. Ukraine has proved that, to go back to your original point, that it has stalled the might of Russia's military machine because every Ukrainian stood up for Ukraine. And I don't think anybody was being asked, do many of us know that Ukraine, which Russia believes is very much part of its Orthodox Christian heritage, is today being led by a Jewish gentleman. He's the leader of the country, and everyone's rallying behind him. So we must understand that the greater good of the country, the image of the country, should surpass political agendas, and therefore at any instance of this nature should be clamped down effectively. We cannot wait for it to go to the courts, with no disrespect to the honorable courts, but decisions take very long. And in that long period of time, a lot of damage is done to people, their psyches, their families, etc. So we have to have a quick mechanism to clip in the wings any initiative which draws concern not nationally, but even internationally. The question to ask is, the media reports about cow vigilantism, media reports about minorities stopping a majority religion procession, but why is it just left to the reportage? Why doesn't the administration of the day rise up above pleasing their political masters or otherwise and address the issue there and then? The police has a job to do. Is it going to wait for the politicians to tell the police what to do? Then what is the police there for? The security agencies have a job to do. So they must address the issues within the brief that is mandated to them by the Constitution. You don't have to have the political leadership to tell you when the sun will rise and when it will set. And that is what is upsetting. And I find that is something that we need to address.
Captain Alok Bansal, in this report also, it mentions in India some officials are ignoring or even supporting rising attacks on people and places of worship. Not the first time. In the past also, police officials specifically, have been targeted. But, look at what happens in the US. Look at the track record of United States of America. We've seen several gun attacks. How does US really describe those gun attacks? It is described as gun culture, but nobody slams the administration that promotes gun culture there. What will you say about the hypocrisy there?
See, there is no doubt about it. The Bill of Rights, the Second Amendment of the US Constitution, actually allows everybody to carry guns. And the gun lobby has actually taken it to such an extent that today you have automatic weapons, rifles, weapons which can only be used for offense and not for defense, are proliferated. People can have number of guns to themselves, and that is leading to gun culture. But what is even more important, if they are accusing Indian officials of complicity or inaction, there have been so many cases when the Black Lives Matter movement was going on. There were so many cases where US security personnel were found complicit, especially police, in ill-treating the blacks. I, by and large, agree with all my fellow panelists, and I think what General Yashmore said is also an important facet, that some of our vernacular media is trying to whip up passions and aggravate or accentuate certain divides, which we need to make sincere efforts to bridge. But one issue with which Dr. Suman said, I have a difference of opinion. He said that in this sort of a debate, you should get the representatives of minority unions or things like that. This is something what Mr. Jinnah would say, that he had the sole right to represent Muslims. We have people from minority communities within the panel. We have people from minority community indicating, but trying to get people from particular unions or particular associations is a proposition which is fraught with dangers. And as India's history tells us, nobody can be given the sole prerogative to represent a particular minority. That fact needs to be appreciated. And I think nobody has any doubts as far as I'm concerned. I think India is one of the very few countries which has, the preamble says it's a secular and socialist state. So secularism is enshrined into the constitution. There may have been some aberrations, but we have dealt with it. The US needs to look inwards and see what they need to do to make it a more racially inclusive society, get over the gun culture, get over the gun firings which have been happening in the US.
Dr. Sumant C. Raman wants to respond.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, just a couple of points. One is when I said minority associations or representatives, they could be elected representatives of political parties as well. So basically, people who we can, in some indirect ways, not precise, but some indirect ways, assume to represent a larger proportion of the minority communities than individuals can on a show. Now, the second point, and this is very important, and this is concerning, is that there is the issue related to the discrimination, subtle, not so subtle, through the various organs of the state. And this is something that we need to look at very, very seriously. So, for instance, I don't know, I'm sure all my co-panelists are aware of the reports which have said that under trials who belong to minority communities, particularly Muslim under trials, tend to spend much longer times before they get bail, and so on. And we have seen specific cases now over the last few years where for offences which on paper at least seem far less severe, there are members of the minority community who are spending increasing amount of time in jail without getting bail, whereas for fairly heinous offences, others are being granted bail. So there is a question about the approach of the state machinery. Police, for instance, I think this has been well documented. And to repeat mention that those from the minority communities who get picked up by the police tend to be worse off than those from the majority community. And I'm not saying that this is only in the last 5 or 6 years. It's probably been there even earlier, but it's increasingly noticeable now. And this is my bigger concern. The media is, yes, one part, mainstream media is the one that sets the narrative along with social media. And that has, over the last 4 or 5 years, taken a blatantly anti-minority line. That's a different issue. But it's not just that. If the organs of the state were even-handed or seen to be even-handed, more as they should be even-handed, that's fine, but they should also be seen to be even-handed. And since there is now a question mark on that very fundamental aspect, does the state see the minorities as equal citizens in every single respect? And I'm talking about minorities who are from the poorest of the poor communities, not necessarily the wealthy among them, who generally tend to do much better off whenever it comes to dealing with the police or dealing with the government institutions. So we have to think about that and forget what the US says. I mean, the US has got no business to say it, and they've got, there are people, yesterday somebody was saying maybe they should be arming all doctors and nurses in the hospitals with automatic weapons to prevent these shootouts.
Shekhar Iyer and Major General Yash Moore, gentlemen, I just want to share a small incident with you. I was returning from Mumbai. This is before COVID. And when I landed in Delhi, I boarded a taxi. It was either an Ola or an Uber cab. A taxi driver, this taxi driver was very talkative. So he was just talking to me, and he got, he started talking because he found out that I work in television. So he told me that, he has met many people, he has ferried many people because he used to work with one of the organizations here as a taxi driver earlier, and then he became a part of Ola or Uber. He said something very interesting and that touched my heart, which I just want to quickly share with you. He said that, Madam, अभी कुछ दिन पहले खबर चला रहे थे टीवी में कि एक दलित लड़की के साथ रेप हो गया है. आप मुझे ये बताइए, एक लड़की तो लड़की होती है, आप उसमें दलित क्यों लगाते हैं? He asked me that question and I had no answer. he understood when we are writing Dalit ladki ke saath rape ho gaya hai, it is us who are saying that wo humse alag hai. That person is somebody else. So here, when we say, why do we not have a representation of the minority community? Why are we, singling them out? If we talk about
sorry, that's
equality,
not the
if
same
we
thing at
say we
all.
are all equal, this is what the Constitution says. No, but how is it not the same thing, Mr. Dr. Sumansi Raman?
No,
Why
Heena,
are we then,
Heena,
as long as we will have that bias in our own head, how can we expect the world to change?
Heena, is not the same thing at all. Can I have a panel to discuss what women think about safety of women in this country and have an all-male panel debate it? It would be absurd.
If women politicians are the lawmakers, if women politicians are making the rules for women in this country, then it is important to have those male politicians coming on the panel and discussing, because they are making the rules for women.
All male. No, you're not getting my point, Heena. I'm saying that when we talk about
no, I just shared an example. I just shared an incident that happened with me. I was reminded of that. Maruf, will you like to respond?
To disagree with you, but the point is that Dr. Raman has a point. I think what he's trying to allude to is that if you had one or two others from the minority community, notwithstanding all the distinguished guests and their capabilities here, you would get more interpretations about why the minorities feel that maybe the report by the US is a shot in the arm for them. I don't believe it is, but the fact is that there are many who would believe that chalo ye nahi bol rahe hain to America ne to bola hamare hit mein. But the point is, it's not America that has to give us a course correction. We have to do wherever, as I brought out earlier, wherever instances come to light, we need to give a course correction. But unfortunately, what I'm witnessing as a trend, and it's not just me, but a lot of people in the liberal community would agree with me, that there tends to be more and more an aggressive positioning, and the media has not painted itself in good colors with this, wherein people are being asked to take sides. That was not the case earlier. Earlier, a good thing was a good thing and a bad thing was a bad thing. And there was very little, at least amongst the educated people, there was very little debate on that. But today, it's all being reduced to my side versus your side. And I think, that kind of fraction and friction between communities is something that many political analysts had written about 5 decades ago, that India bordered on vociferous tendencies. Vociferous tendencies would come out of people taking sides. I have always believed, and I've looked at myself as an Indian first and everything else later. And if you can't grow out of your colloquial or your limited biases, then you show that in the way you conduct yourself, in the way you comment on things, because you show that you have not evolved. That's it.
I have very little time left on the debate, and I'd like to give last 10 seconds each to Shekhar Iyer and Major General Yash Moore for the closing comments. Shekhar Iyer, very quickly, 10 seconds, please.
Heena, I think we were talking about course corrections, and sometimes things are getting overboard. I would draw attention to the fact that the RSS chief Mohan Bhagwatji himself yesterday came out with this observation that let's not look for shivling in every mosque. I think that's a very clear message. A few days ago, Prime Minister Modi told party leaders, look, be careful of these kind of issues. In fact, a direction has gone to the BJP rank and file not to say anything on this issue other than the first reactions that we saw from the UP leaders. I think everyone is aware that this is not the way it should forward, because this does hijack from the main agenda of the government and all of us, that we need faster development, we need, and also inclusivity. Because the fact that some people are going to the court.
Yes,
Let it
Major
remain
General
there.
Yashmore,
But
last 10 seconds. I'm completely out of time.
I'll just say this. If you remember what Atal Bihari Vajpayee said after Gujarat riots, he said, Raj Dharam apnao. So people in power of positions, whether the day you become a minister or in a position of authority, then you don't only have to be fair, you have to appear to be fair. You cannot use language which appears to be, for the other people that it is targeting them or something like that. Somewhere there, I think the narrative needs to change. People in position need to be very fair, appear fair, and we need to bring our minorities along and hold hands and move as a nation. Otherwise, this kind of atmosphere that is created is not good in long run for a country like India.
All right, gentlemen, thank you very much, all of you, for joining us on Urban Debate on Mirror Now this evening. It was a rather interesting session, heading into a very, very short break, but there's lots lined up for you on the other side as well. We'll tell you what's happening with COVID pandemic. The numbers are rising again. More details on the other side.